Good morning, everyone. So we will slowly get started. Some people are still coming, but because we need to finish at 11:30 sharp, because we have the keynote plenary after this one, we should get started. I'm very happy to welcome you to this session. The title of this panel is Impact Evaluation in the Context of Climate Fragility. I'm very honored to be surrounded by great panelists and a great discussion on my left. I'll introduce them in a minute, but I wanted to introduce you to this panel and the theme of this plenary. So climate is one of the main themes of this event. I think it became clear that either climate programming or programs to support vulnerable populations to face shocks and stressors became a key priority in almost all organizations. I think yesterday it was at the donor panel that it was mentioned that climate programming should be multi-sectoral, and so we should all work together. I think it's great in this panel today. We have 4 organizations, FAO, WFP, World Bank, and UNICEF, and I think we should also focus right on what we do best. And I think this type of events are great to discuss what we are doing, what evidence we are generating, and make sure that we talk to each other and we complement each other. And I think you will see that we will cover different types of climate programming or programs that support people suffering from shocks and stressors, especially climate shocks. And these cover a range of programs, including anticipatory action, resilience program, climate adaptation, and so on and so forth. So let me quickly introduce the panelists. So on my left, I have Gernot Lagande. He was the head of climate, the director of climate in WFP, and he just transitioned to UNICEF to head the climate division. On my right, I have Paul Christian, senior economist at DIME, World Bank. Next to him is Silvio Daidone, impact evaluation specialist in FAO. And on the right, Elke de Boer is an evaluation specialist in UNICEF. And me, I'm Jennifer Weiler, I'm evaluation officer in the impact evaluation team in WFP. So we'll get started. At the end, we'll have time for discussions. We'll have 4 presentations. And so I'll present some of the evidence we have been generating in the last 5 years on resilience programs in WFP. But first, we wanted to show you a video that we prepared for this forum, summarizing all the work that the Impact Evaluation Unit has been doing on climate and resilience since 2019.
Climate shocks pose one of the biggest threats to fighting hunger. 80% of the world's food insecure people live in countries where natural disasters are increasingly devastating land and ecosystems, and where floods, drought, and cyclones strike at unprecedented rates. The United Nations World Food Programme, WFP, is responding swiftly, delivering social safety nets, building resilience, preparing for the storm. But how do we know if we're making a difference? In 2019, the WFP Office of Evaluation launched an impact evaluation window on climate change and resilience. Together with the World Bank's Development Impact Department and other partners, we're generating rigorous evidence in 7 countries: Bangladesh, Ghana, Mali, Nepal, Niger, Rwanda, and South Sudan. Evidence showed that resilience programs where households receive cash in exchange for working on land restoration and agriculture projects boosted food security, even 2 years after the start of the programs. Food security impact showed up differently across countries. In Niger and South Sudan, results appeared mostly after harvest due to increases in agricultural production, while in Rwanda, benefits emerged gradually after the initial transfers. In the Asia-Pacific region, anticipatory action programs that provided cash ahead of extreme floods in Bangladesh and Nepal improved food security and mental well-being during the first crucial weeks of the disaster.
Here in South Sudan, WFP and UNICEF are working to build the resilience of more than 550,000 beneficiaries through a package of interventions that includes livelihoods, water, sanitation and hygiene, education, health, and nutrition. The impact evaluation highlighted how joint WFP and UNICEF programming and implementation can maximize on impact. The findings of the impact evaluation are being used to design resilience projects in South Sudan. Plans underway include strategies to increase access to health and nutrition services, ensuring timely distribution of cash transfers before the laying season.
Here in Ghana, an impact evaluation of a WP program that supports farmers through cash transfer assessed whether it's better for farmers to receive the money all at once before planting season or a monthly payment. Evidence shows that households receiving all the cash upfront earned 9% higher income from agricultural sales. They produced more, spent significantly more on fertilizer, and cultivated 5% more land. This group also experienced higher level of food security, though this evened out as monthly transfers group received all the cash. The evaluation found that children from households receiving monthly transfers attended school more often, suggesting regular payments bring educational benefits. These findings show that decision on how and when to deliver cash depend on the program's objectives.
Here in Nepal, climate change is having a dramatic impact on the lives and livelihoods of all people. WFP is working closely with the government to carry out an impact evaluation in areas prone to floods. This impact evaluation aims to inform us whether households who receive cash early on are indeed better off than households that receive the traditional post-shock assistance. Now, initial evidence is very clear. The earlier, the better. This type of impact evaluation is fundamental to the work we do, and it will inform us, government and partners across the region on whether and where to scale up these type of climate resilience approaches.
Sorry. No. Okay. Sorry for that. Okay, I think that was a good snapshot of all the work we have been doing. For this presentation, I will focus on specifically 4 impact evaluations we have been conducted on integrated programming in WFP and the impacts on resilience, outcomes, and then Paul will focus on anticipatory action. So I apologize, there should be a slide here on all the, all the evaluation teams involved in each country, which, as you can imagine, there are a lot of people. So in order to conduct this type of work, we need a lot of people, so both from WFP and from the World Bank. I'm just in this, I have the honor to be presenting this, but of course, I'm presenting this on behalf of many, many people that work on this in the last 4 years. And of course, I want to acknowledge the generous contributions from the donors. So this resilience evidence generation relies heavily on funding we got from Germany, who funded the impact evaluations in South Sudan, Niger, and Mali, and COICA, Korea, funded the Rwanda impact evaluation. So the main evaluation question we answer in these studies is how does food assistance for assets or food assistance for assets complemented with other interventions, such as, for instance, lean season support, nutrition support, contribute to resilience. So we conducted these evaluations in 4 countries, as I mentioned, and in all these cases, we compare communities receiving the FFA or integrated package with communities not receiving the package. In all of these cases, we use randomized controlled trials. All of these cases, so the design is very similar. There's some variations, but in all of these cases, we can actually assess the contribution of FFA or integrated interventions on resilience. We started this work late 2020, early 2021. We collected baseline data before these interventions. And we surveyed over 10,000 households in over 300 communities. Before the intervention, alongside the intervention, collected high-frequency data, and I will explain later why. And end-line data 2 years post-intervention. I just want to mention also that the reason why we could do an RCT is because there was not enough funding to cover all of the communities. Okay, so I want to also tell you a bit more, tell you a bit more about what is food for assets. Food assistance for assets, it's quite a popular intervention in WFP. The idea is that people, vulnerable communities, receive cash or food in exchange for work they do on communities or household assets. These are intended to build their resilience against climate shocks and usually relate to, for instance, improving agriculture, restoring degraded landscapes. So what you can see on the left, for instance, this is one of the most popular assets in Niger. You may have seen it before, is the demi-lune or half-moon, which increase soil restoration and also storing water, etc. Okay, now I got it right. Okay, so one of the contributions of this work is how we measure resilience. You may know that resilience definition is always a subject of debate. So we used the definition from the technical working group of the Food Security and Information Network that defines resilience as the capacity to ensure that shocks and stressors do not have long-lasting adverse development consequences. So, and acknowledging that there are limitations in measuring resilience at one point in time. So, in the past years, most of the impact evaluations were measuring resilience at one point in time or before and after. But actually, we build on proposals from Barrett and Constance and Chisean Barrett, who conceptualize resilience in a dynamic way, so as avoidance of poverty in the face of shocks and stressors. So what we do in this case, how we operationalize it, is by measuring directly welfare dynamics through these high-frequency surveys. So we interview people also alongside the impact evaluation every 2 months. In these cases, we do it, in some cases, we do it by phone, like in Rwanda. In other cases, we do it in person, interviewing a subset of the beneficiaries. So we understand that people are more resilient if their livelihoods are well adapted to their environments, if they can avoid shocks and stressors, and if they can transform and improve their well-being over time. Okay, so why I'm calling it meta-analysis? Because now we basically finished these 4 impact evaluations, and because, as I was mentioning before, we evaluate very similar programs and we use the same questionnaires, we are able to pull this data together and generate estimates for the interventions as a whole, and which are more generalizable, right? That just focusing on one country. So I'm calling this, we are calling this meta-analysis. So what are the 3 questions we answer and how we are operationalizing this measure of resilience? Okay, so first we look at the impacts on food security 2 years after the intervention. Then we ask ourselves, when do these impacts occur? And then in this case, we take advantage of this high-frequency data to understand better the seasonal dynamics. Are improvements in food security happening at specific points in time, during lean season, during harvest? And then we also want to understand the mechanisms, right? So if these programs improve food security, how do they improve food security? By changing livelihoods, but by helping people better absorb shocks or adapt to their environment. So I will give a snapshot of the findings. Of course, in the reports, we dig more into all of these outcomes. So starting with food security, what we are seeing, so here in the graph, you see, by country, the impacts on food security, and at the end, we see this pool estimate. It's called inverse variance weighted average. The idea is that it's an average that gives more weight to those estimates that are more precisely estimated. So let's say we reward kind of precision, right? So lower variance. So what we are saying is that overall, there's evidence that these programs tend to improve food security, even 2 years after the start of the intervention. However, we see some difference in size. But basically, having data from multiple countries makes us more confident. I also want to mention that in this case, I'm showing the food consumption score. So, we are seeing that for some countries it's not significant, but we do see, for instance, positive and significant impacts on other measures of food security, like the food insecurity experience scale, which is a subjective measure which captures experience of food insecurity. So, for instance, in Rwanda and South Sudan, we do see impacts on FIS. But here, overall, in the pool estimate, we do see positive and significant impacts. So following our structure, the question was, when do these impacts occur? So this is the example of Niger. You see the impacts alongside the agricultural calendar. And contrary to what we thought in the first time when we started this work, we are seeing that the impacts are not concentrated in the lean season, which is when people are most food insecure, but rather in the harvest season. So this has an explanation, and it's come, but in the beginning we were surprised because we would expect, okay, we expect these programs to protect people when they need it the most. So what's happening? What we are seeing is that the main pathway, meaning why people are increasing food security, is because they harvest more. So we are seeing in South Sudan and in Niger, people are producing more crops. So here you don't see the magnitude because it's expressing standard deviations, but actually this means around 60 kilograms more crops on average per household per year. So it's quite significant. We are not seeing this in Rwanda, for instance. In Rwanda, we see other pathways, and this has an explanation. It's also because the way the program was designed was a bit different than in the other countries. But yeah, overall, in these pool estimates, in the meta-analysis, we see that the main pathway to increase agricultural production is through increases in, the main pathway to increase food security is through increases in agricultural production. Other livelihoods, so we don't see so much here. As I was saying, we do see some impacts on business activities in Rwanda, not so much on livestock, and some indication also that households are more likely to engage in paid work when also they participate in these resilience interventions. Okay, so as usual, impacts are not homogeneous, right? We can see difference, for instance, by sex, by proximity to assets, and I want to show two main findings when we do heterogeneity analysis. One interesting finding in South Sudan is that we are seeing that female-headed households benefit less from this intervention. The reason is that we see that the main reason for improvements in food security is agricultural production, but female-headed households are less likely to own land, and therefore we see that their impacts on food security are lower. The reason why here we see UCT and FFA is because in South Sudan we were able to have a second treatment arm and able to compare the difference between FFA, so more conditional transfers, with unconditional. This is also very interesting. I think Jonas will also present more work more on this. And of course, we will share the reports. In Niger, we also see that actually impacts are not the same for everyone. And those people living closer to the implementation sites, so to where assets were being built, so the food security improved the most. So this is also interesting learning. Okay, so some of the key takeaways, we see that FFA or FFA Plus improves food security. As I mentioned, one of the main mechanisms is to increase agricultural production. However, we see difference between countries. So we see some impacts on assets owned in South Sudan. I haven't shown here, but we also see actually in Niger improvements in psychological well-being and social capital. and also increases in business ownership in Rwanda. I think this increased by around 5 percentage points. Yet there is scope to strengthen these programs to achieve even stronger impacts on resilience. For instance, households do not show much changes in off-farm livelihood diversification, and this is important to build people's adaptation to climate shocks. And households continue to experience lower levels of food security in the lean season. So this has implications, for instance, for timing of transfers. In some cases, it could be that people were waiting until harvest and investing in that, but it could also be, there were some delays in transfer distribution. So ensuring that transfers are distributed when they should be is also important. And also there's room to strengthen some of the resilience components. But this is just a snapshot that I want to leave it there and give the floor to Paul. So these are the two published reports. Mali and Rwanda are upcoming. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for being here, choosing our session to come to. This agenda is really about the benefits of planning ahead and about coordination, so it's really nice to be here presenting this to a group like this, where all the key partners who are needed to do this kind of planning and coordination are exactly here. So this is exactly the kind of people who are sort of poised to be able to act on this information. So very happy to share these very brief highlights of this agenda with you. So this session is about the benefits of an activity called forecast-based anticipatory action. So the key question is, how do we know how much bigger are the impacts of delivering humanitarian assistance as quickly as possible when we expect a crisis to happen? So it means basically pre-committing and pre-mobilizing to provide humanitarian relief like cash transfers or food aid as quickly as possible when we think a disaster is about to happen. And this is an important agenda because there's increasing focus on the need to do this and increasing ability to be able to act in these ways. So on the supply side, for more anticipatory action, we have better forecasts, better data, better functioning, more efficient payment modalities, all of this which makes it easier to predict when new disasters are going to happen, sometimes even before the disasters are actually starting to affect the vulnerable populations we're worried about. Also, if you showed up to this session, it's probably because you're worried about the increasing pressures and demand for humanitarian relief. So we all know that increasing extreme weather is putting more pressure on resources to act. So we need to really understand how much additional benefit do we get from the effort we make on coordination and trying to act early. How much more bang for our buck can we get if we invest in systems that allow us to act quickly? So just if you think about what's the case for acting quickly compared to other actions like sort of ongoing food assistance, like Jennifer was presenting, intuitively, we might expect that the immediate needs are most acute when a disaster is happening. So it may be right after a flood or as a flood is happening that people are most dealing with food security and stress. We might also hope or expect that providing cash early that allows it to be used flexibly might allow households to avoid negative coping strategies like asset sales and might allow recovery to happen faster, which might sort of let the cash transfers pay for themselves. Not sure if there's something I need to do to get it back, but I can keep talking while we... So when you show the benefits of acting early, it starts to sound like, of course, we should be doing this everywhere and we don't need an impact evaluation. We should just, if we can do it, we could scale it up. But it's actually important to understand the magnitudes because there might be some offsetting concerns. So one of them, for example, that it may not actually be right at the moment when the trigger is exceeded that the food security is the worst. So, for example, especially when droughts are triggered or expected, it might not be when the forecast happens, but it might be later when the subsequent lean season is happening that you expect food security to actually be the worst, and that might be the right time to act. Second, there may be challenges with actually implementing and delivering. So, for example, if markets are disrupted while the flood is happening, the impact of transfers made during that time might not actually be realized. And finally, there's a potential trade-off where if we don't know who's going to be the most affected when a trigger is activated, we may end up making targeting errors of accidentally giving to populations who don't end up being affected. So even if those impacts are bigger when we act early, there might be a trade-off with targeting errors. So we need to know exactly how much bigger benefit we get when we act early to offset the potential forecast error. So we need evidence to resolve this uncertainty, and we need impact evaluations to tell us the answers to these questions. So I'm going to run through 3 cases in a short time to show you the impacts of these. If you came to the forum last year, you might have seen the very early results from this one, the flood response in Nepal, where we really focus on the question of when we deliver transfers as quickly as possible, when a flood is forecast, so rivers breaking their banks and start flooding, how much bigger are the impacts of those transfers compared to what would normally happen of waiting to mobilize a response after the disaster. We're going to use an RCT to measure this. So instead of scaling up everyone immediately into receiving cash transfers on the forecast, we're going to choose a subset of eligible populations to be enrolled in that group and compare them to people who receive on a normal timeline a month later. And the intervention is just going to be a cash transfer. So it's 15,000 Nepali rupees, or a little over $100. That's delivered when a river level exceeds a pre-specified danger level, indicating that people can expect flooding to reach their households in about 3 days. So very basic RCT, totally familiar. We have 140 households who would have been eligible. And instead of just rushing forward and scaling up everyone into this new method all at once, we randomly assign half of the communities to be in the group who's going to receive the cash later, and the other half to stay with what would have normally been happening, which is receiving cash about 6 to 8 weeks after the flood. But we do deliver early warning to everyone. So if we expect a flood is happening, we're not withholding that information from people. So it's going to be the impact of the cash, not necessarily the warning that the flood is coming. So without any suspense, just ripping the Band-Aid off, here's the results in one graph on food security. So this figure, the way to read these figures are that we've got impacts measured at 3 periods. And it's because it's an RCT, we know that the only difference between the blue lines who receive the cash transfers and the red lines who receive them only later is because of the impact of receiving the cash early. So the first thing that happens is on the far left side of this figure, flood triggers are activated and transfers are made as quickly as possible to the blue group, the FBA recipients. In our first survey round, only the forecast-based anticipatory action group has received cash transfers, and the counterfactual group is the group who's still waiting to receive support, the group who hasn't received support yet. And in that period, we can measure a big statistically significant effect on, for example, here, the share of households who are achieving acceptable food security as measured by the food consumption score. Later, the next thing that happens is the normal flood response is mobilized, and the second group receives their cash transfers exactly as they normally would if we hadn't been rolling out this new anticipatory action framework. And when we follow up to do a survey after both these groups have gotten cash, we now find that both groups are exactly the same. If anything, the AA group is doing slightly better, but we can't reject that they're in exactly the same place. And it's important to note that that's actually good news for the anticipatory action effect. So they received their cash more recently, and they're still achieving just as good of a level of food security as a group who's received cash more recently. So they have this initial benefit and then stay achieving similar levels of food security. When we follow up after the subsequent agricultural season, we don't see a huge impact on this measure that by reinvesting in agricultural decisions, there's a sort of rebound effect of accelerated recovery. But again, we still see these two groups achieving similar levels of food security. So the way we read this effect is that the early group is achieving about 10% better food security during the flood response, even though we're transferring exactly the same amount of money to these two groups. So there's a benefit of acting early with equivalent expenditure on transfer values. But we don't only care about food security, we also care about the experience of these households. So I'm just going to highlight one more quick measure here, which is subjective well-being. We also collect lots of measures of mental health. And you see a sort of similar pattern here, that the main impacts of acting early are achieving what you would expect to be the impacts of cash transfers. People report better well-being, better mental health in the immediate period after the cash transfers. that sustains a little bit, even compared to a group who receives cash transfers more recently once we get to the subsequent rounds. But by the time the next agricultural season has happened and everybody's kind of back to their equilibrium, everybody sort of converges to the same point. The one area where we do find an impact on livelihoods is when we focus most on the most flood-affected households. We do find that those groups benefit by having slightly higher expenditures on agricultural inputs and higher harvests in the subsequent season, which suggests the benefits of being able to target as much as you can. So if you can really make sure this is delivered to the most flood-affected households, you might see a bit of a additional pay-for-itself effect of better livelihoods. But everyone achieves the better food security and better mental health impacts of acting early. And we don't see any impacts on other livelihoods like business, wages, or rearing of livestock. So some of you might have already seen some of those results if you came to the forum last year, but just to make sure we're not repeating ourselves and make sure there's continued effort to show up, one of the exciting things we're doing is replicating these experiments in other contexts. So now we have results that are fresh off the presses from Bangladesh, where we implemented a similar experiment of cash transfers where we vary the timeline and test specifically the impact of scaling into transfers being made as quickly as possible, again, when river heights exceed a predetermined level. And relative to Nepal, there's going to be two innovations. So the first is now in Nepal, people had to pick up their transfers from collection points, which means it takes a few days for the cash to arrive. In Bangladesh, it's mobile money. So everyone's pre-registered, which means the moment the flood trigger forecast, tens of thousands of households receive cash in their accounts all on the same day. So one of the fastest types of actions that WFP can make. And we're going to do 3 comparison groups, not just the early group, but a later group. So because I already described how to read these graphs, I'm going to go over it quickly. The only new innovation is we've added, so now we have the blue group who receives their cash by mobile money the moment the trigger is activated. The yellow group receives it in the 2 weeks after the flood, so sort of indicating the benefit of pre-committing to act very quickly, but not necessarily before the flood. And the red group reflects the normal transfer timeline. So what we see is that acting before the flood has the biggest advantages. It's this blue group who achieves the best food security as measured by food consumption score here, and they sustain that level. Though by the end, when the traditional group has received their transfers, we can't reject that they're all the same. But the early groups are still achieving just as good of a level of food security well after the floods have receded compared to a group who received transfers more recently. We find similar effects on mental health. So here I'm showing the share of people with anxiety and depression. So it's actually flipped. Now higher numbers are bad things. That's more anxiety and depression. So the acting early group, the blue group, has this major benefit that we see that comes especially from the period right when the floods are happening. So you see the biggest gaps emerging by acting early as people are being surveyed while they're still likely experiencing the direct impacts of the flood. So we find supporting evidence like this on better subjective well-being, fewer negative coping strategies, and it really starts to line up and build to a body of evidence, including on other studies on similar droughts, that better food security and mental health comes specifically from the benefit of delivering cash transfers as quickly as possible and getting those transfers to happen as quickly as we can. With the risk of overwhelming, I just wanted to mention that we've done this, that these kinds of experiments have been done in the context not just of river droughts only in South Asia, but also for other disasters in other contexts. So I'm just going to highlight with 2 slides evidence from a similar kind of approach for an adaptive social protection project in Niger that tests not just measuring when the river starts to break its banks, but when a drought is forecast to affect food security. So a bad harvest is forecast to affect food security in a subsequent season. And there, our colleagues at DIME tested the impact of delivering transfers at different timelines. So is it best to deliver the cash right at the moment the drought trigger is activated, or is it better to wait to the subsequent lean season and deliver cash transfers to support food consumption during the subsequent lean season? There's a lot crowded into this graph, so don't worry about it if you don't see the impacts too clearly, but just to summarize, the impacts of what we find are, when we compare the benefits of acting early, the group who receives the cash early, so that's the red line here in this figure, does experience a benefit on food security and other measures immediately when the transfers are happening. But there's a bit of an offsetting effect here in this context, where there is actually a bit more advantage of acting during the lean season than we saw before. So on average, we still see a benefit of acting early, better food security in the period right when the trigger is exceeded. But the benefits add up slightly differently because in the drought context, the response is happening over such a long period that there's a bit of an offsetting effect on the subsequent lean season. So it's important to test these strategies in as many of these contexts as we can to measure how contexts or things like which disasters we're responding to is mediating the impacts. I'm just going to summarize with my last minute on summarizing what I think are the emerging lessons and then highlight priorities for this agenda. So I think the evidence is starting to become clear that cash delivered early has the specific benefit of supporting outcomes like food security and mental health at the stage when this cash is delivered. So if that's the moment when a flood is happening, what that means is acting early gives you better food security and mental health while people are responding for the floods. And it's both important and possible to rigorously document these impacts. So we sometimes get the objection that it's really hard to do impact evaluations on climate response because we don't know where the climate events are happening. But by pre-committing and pre-planning that we're going to do these impact evaluations wherever the disasters happen, the group of people in this room are exactly the kind of people who can generate this evidence, because we're the ones who are able to say we're going to go to wherever the disasters are and implement the impact evaluations. Finally, just to highlight work to be done, a lot of this kind of work, acting early, depends on high quality forecasts. So we're going to be hearing about that in a session later today, about improvements in the ability to forecast the kinds of things that affect hunger. So you can think about forecasting both events like droughts, floods, monsoon onset, cyclones, or the outcomes like the food insecurity and conflict that might happen as a result of these things. But we want to think about how decisions about targeting and timing can affect the trade-offs on getting these benefits from acting early versus the risk of acting on forecasts that might have error. So finally, if you're thinking about proposing your projects for impact evaluation, some of the things I think would be especially interesting or exciting to study would be thinking about the targeting decisions that go into this, like how the use of registries that affect who's going to get impacts determines targeting errors, and specifically who benefits when receiving transfers. So just connecting to work that WFP and DIME are doing on testing, for example, what are the different impacts we get by targeting women specifically to receive the transfers? Those could be have different modalities, and I'm not showing that in that presentation, but there's important work going on in that space. We're thinking about decisions like what complementary activities or when to act. So the video mentioned an experiment we're doing on testing. Do we give all the cash at once at the beginning of the season in Ghana, or do we provide regular transfers throughout the season? Those kinds of decisions are likely to kind of moderate and mediate the kind of impacts we see in these programs. So just to highlight, really exciting to see some early successes, but lots more to do on this agenda. So don't walk away from this thinking we're done. Excited to talk about what your programs are doing and what else we could do next. So I'll hand to Silvio.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So with respect to the previous two presentations, I won't discuss any impact evaluations findings from ongoing FAO evaluation or recent FAO evaluation. This is more a wishful list of projects that we would like to evaluate that are in the context of the Green Climate Fund financing. So we have heard yesterday from some of our colleagues that one of the most prominent evidence gap that we have in the literature, in development impact evaluation literature, relates to the effectiveness of those projects that seek to combat climate change. Now, with respect to the GCF, I don't know if you are aware of it, but the GCF is the world's largest fund for climate action that has been established as a funding mechanism for the United Nations Framework Commission on Climate Change in 2010 to support developing countries scale up efforts to meet the Paris Agreement targets, which I remind you are containing the global rising temperature within below 2 degrees Celsius. FAO has multiple activities under the GCF funding. First of all, it's an accredited entity to the GCF, supports countries to develop and implement funding proposal of transformative projects which have low to medium environmental and social risk, and overall, including both the co-financings and the grants part, may reach about $250 million. Then the FAO is also a partner of other accredited entities, so collaborate to implement specific parts, specific project components. So we are not as part of the leadership in the consortium, but we are more supervised by the other accredited entity. And then it's also a delivery partner for this readiness and preparatory support program, which is a lot about strengthening institutional capacity and governance mechanism, especially aligning with the nationally determined contribution, the national adaptation plans, and whatever kind of climate strategies, climate change strategies there is in the country. It's interesting also to notice that for all these projects that are the transformative projects for which we have developed funding proposals that have been approved by the GCF. We have generally one component that is following this third bullet point that you can see in the slide. So we have typically one component that seeks to strengthen the institutional capacity of the government. So this is pretty much the total value of FAO GCF portfolio. We have just reached in November with the latest funding approvals by the Secretariat, 1.4 billion, which are pretty much divided across adaptation and mitigation programs, even though there are many programs that are cross-cutting. So we're talking about for mitigation, all those programs related to reforestation and afforestation. Adaptation, as you know, it's a bit of a mix. There is a lot going from anticipatory action to climate resilient agriculture, landscape management, on-farm water management. So there's a lot of stuff inside that the category. And the 23 transformative projects that have been approved by the GCF reaches about $1.25 billion. Then the two other components are clearly less important in terms of financing because each one contributes for around $70 million. And you can see here in the map the geographic distribution of the project. This is not the latest one, actually, because this dates back to July. But in November, we have received funding approval for two other projects in Iraq and in Somalia, which are obviously two very interesting cases because we have the climate resilience issue that interrelates, overlap with the context of fragility and polycrisis. The GCF evaluation policy stipulates that all evaluation for the GCF they have to contribute to the overall performance of the fund by developing accountability and creating a culture of learning which is built by producing and using at the same time independent, impartial, and trusted evidence. Basically, as an accredited entity, FAO has to submit because of the monitoring and accountability framework to evaluation at the midterm, an interim evaluation, and a final evaluation. So this is an obligation that we have towards the GCF. And in the funding agreement, also we agree on the timeline of this evaluation. Clearly, for the interim, we have to submit a report more or less towards halfway towards the project implementation, while the final evaluation is generally towards the end, even though we have some cases where we have to submit it after project is completed. So clearly the focus of these two evaluation is different. It's more formative for an interim midline evaluation and more summative for a final evaluation. They have basically two different learning components. One is for improving and the management and the implementation, and the other one is trying to understand what has worked and what has not worked, and is mostly for learning for future programming. So the accredited entities have to apply a broad range of evaluation criteria to frame these two reports. The first 5 that are coherent with what is included in the OECD DAC guidelines relates to relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. But because of the GCF guidelines, we have also to report on other criteria and related evaluation questions. But we have some flexibility, obviously, concerning what we can do and what we cannot do in the two phases. So clearly, for instance, when you talk about impact and sustainability, this is very, very relevant for an endline evaluation, while it is less important for a midterm evaluation. It's very important also the inception phase for the design of the evaluation in the monitoring accountability framework, because this is the moment, obviously, as you know, as impact evaluation specialist, where we can design the most rigorous design. And this is true not just for the impact evaluation component, the quantitative component, but also for the qualitative assessment. We have also some flexibility in terms of the methodology that we would like to use. So ideally, we would like to use mixed methods approaches, provided that we provide some discussion concerning the limitation that we might face during the implementation of the evaluation. Another important point that I would like to raise concerning these projects is related to the LORTA programming, which is led by the independent evaluation unit of the GCF. The goal of this program is to strengthen the capacity of the accredited entities and the implementing partners in assessing the impact of their intervention. And this is done with various tools. The GCF Independent Evaluation Unit basically organizes a global workshop once a year, where the accredited entities, the project staff, the country, the governments of the project that have been approved by the Secretariat, they meet to discuss the impact evaluation of the project, the importance of producing a good theory of change, the selection of the indicators. And then once this global workshop is completed, then we have a country-level workshop where we validate these designs, okay? So not all GCF projects are included because the participation is volunteer and is typically around 15-20% of the projects that are approved by the secretariats are included into LORTA. So these are the list of countries where we have ongoing activities. Actually, the only impact evaluation that we have at the moment is in Paraguay for PROESA, where we have done just the baseline survey. This started in 2020. But because of the pandemic, because of 2 changes in governments, and this is a national program, right? So the ownership of the program is a serious matter. So we weren't able to start it earlier, because technically speaking, this should have really started in 2019, but then basically started 3 years afterwards. So as you can see, we have a mix of programmatic teams, mainly focused on adaptation. We have produced some inception designs that we are discussing with the country offices and with other governance partners. And then we are planning for next year to start the validation workshop at the country level, so that we can move ahead with our baselines. So with the exception of Pakistan, really, where we just did the midterm report, the other countries, even if they started 2 or 3 last year or 2 years ago, we are still on time to produce some baseline because of the slow implementation. So just to give you a very quick update on what we have done in Paraguay. This is a reforestation program that has been conducted in the eastern part of the country, and it's combined with basically some climate resilience agriculture. So it's a mix, actually. It's a cross-cutting from both mitigation and adaptation intervention. It's an environmental conditional cash transfer targeting the vulnerable households that are part of Tecopora, which is the national social cash transfer, which have some land available for reforestation and is combined with CSA training. We have 6 agroforestry models in the project. Which combines native species with exotic species for income generation, or even citrus production or yerba mate production. Then we have a second component with incentives to medium-sized landowners to make forest biomass increase more environmentally friendly, even though given the nature of this component is not very suitable to the impact evaluation, because the second component targets only 200 potential beneficiaries. And the third component, as I mentioned, is about strengthening institutional capacity, which is something in common to many of these projects. So actually, the impact evaluation targets only component 1 of PROESA. So PROESA has been, the impact evaluation design of PROESA has been discussed with various partners in phases, both at the global meeting in Bangkok with all the other accredited entities projects. We had 2 validation workshops in Paraguay, and then during the pandemic, we had frequent Zoom calls to try to fine-tune the design. We started with very high expectation with the randomized control trial, with the phased-in approach, having 2 components, with the 2 interventions within component 1 to be randomly allocated, including an efficient stove intervention. But then in the end, because of several problems that we faced also with the governance of the project, we have to reduce our expectation and did basically a diff in diff with matching. Also, we had very many problems in terms of the budget, because at the origins, the Office of Evaluation was not involved in the design of the budget, which has serious implication, obviously, as you can imagine, in terms of conducting an impact evaluation. We are changing completely, obviously, this with the new proposal that have been approved in Malawi and Somalia, for instance. Dedicated impact evaluation budget are now included. And for the other project, actually, we are trying, for instance, in Jordan, Guatemala, and Bolivia, we are trying to leverage on what Clemencia said yesterday. So basically, the Office of Evaluation of FAO works like a tax, is based on taxations through the trust fund, and given the many projects, the many projects that are carried out each year, we are trying to create a mass of that can be used in the mass of funds that can be used to evaluate rigorously these GCF projects that are very big. I mean, we are talking about 30, 50, $80 million project overall. The diff in diff design has been combined with in a random encouragement design in 2022 in order to increase the PROESA uptake, because since the moment that we registered the beneficiary, there were something like 3 to 6 months that were passing, so we might have lost some potential beneficiaries in the meanwhile. So we have launched this experiment to understand whether some simple nudge could increase PROESA uptake. I mean, I do not have I'm not showing the results because they are not as comprehensive as what our colleagues have done, but this is just to provide you with the framework what the Office of Evaluation is planning to do in the next few years. Thanks.
All
All right, we are coming to our last brief presentation, and I will try to keep it really brief because we have a hard stop at past, and we want to leave a little bit of time for discussion. So what I'm presenting is also not a completed impact evaluation, but it's an impact feasibility assessment of our climate resilient WASH interventions, which we conducted over the past year. And I will briefly describe why it was needed, how we did it, and the outcome of this small assessment. By evaluating the impacts of UNICEF climate action for children, what we know from the available data is that the global climate crisis has already exposed nearly every child to climate and environmental hazards, and most of the world's children live in countries at extremely high risks. To respond to this threat, in 2020, UNICEF has committed itself to shift all of its WASH programs to be climate resilient. And last year, UNICEF released its new Sustainability and Climate Change Action Plan. UNICEF climate programming has also been growing over the past years with an increasing number of climate-related interventions targeted both at adaptation and mitigation. And so far, we have not systematically evaluated these programs and especially not evaluated their impact. How are we getting ready to do these evaluations? And what you see on these slides are three key initiatives that we are implementing this year and next year. One is the development of UNICEF guidance on climate integration and evaluation. The second is the impact feasibility assessment that I'm speaking about today. And the third one is upcoming next year, which is UNICEF's first global evaluation of our work in disaster risk reduction and climate. All of this work, and in particular the impact feasibility assessment, are in the context of our new UNICEF evaluation of impact strategy and action framework that tries to systematically build up our impact evaluation capacity and the impact evaluation capacity of our programs. And the IFA that I'm presenting here is the fourth of these exercises conducted by UNICEF using an objective, systematic, and consultative approach and an increasingly well-established methodology. Our impact feasibility assessments go through a series of 4 steps, which are illustrated on the slide. The first step is an evidence review, where we are reviewing the global impact evidence against a theory of change, in this case, the climate resilient WASH theory of change, which didn't quite exist, so had to be assembled. The second stage is mapping of what are we doing and which types of programs might suit themselves for an impact evaluation. Then there was stage 3, where we were developing specific designs for selected programs that looked at opportunities, not necessarily one approach, but several options for assessing impact or getting as close as possible to it. And the last one is a recommendation stage, where we are looking at the systematic integration of outcome and impact level measurements into planned evaluation on climate resilient WASH. Currently, we have completed the first and second stage. We are in the process of finalizing the third and the fourth stage of this assessment. And what you see on this slide is briefly summarizing what we found when conducting the evidence review. Perhaps these results are not fully surprising. What our team found is that the available evidence is very limited, and here they were looking not at former impact evaluations of WASH programs, but specifically at the climate angle. So did those impact evaluations look at climate resilient WASH specifically, and in almost all cases that wasn't the case. There were very few impact evaluations in general, very few systematic reviews of the WASH sector, and a lot of them focusing on WASH and health, not focusing on WASH and climate. Within UNICEF, there was at the time only one completed WASH evaluation that explicitly looked at climate-resilient WASH, and this wasn't an impact evaluation. However, throughout the literature, both internally and externally, there were many claims, of relationships between climate-related work and anticipated outcomes, but limited evidence whether or not, these relationships actually hold up to closer scrutiny. The second slide here is looking at the outcome of the mapping exercise. So here we try to figure out, what are we already doing and which countries and specific programs might suit themselves for integrating an impact component into ongoing or planned evaluations. And we did that by looking at a large number of different criteria. Important ones included, of course, the needs, vulnerability of the sector to climate events in specific countries, which is illustrated on the map. But there were many other considerations, and most importantly, obviously, what are we doing in the different country offices? Where in the planning and implementation cycle of a particular program are we? Because the idea here with the exercise was to look at real program, not at hypothetical programs, which we might or might not come into being in the next few years. There were quite a few of opportunities identified by the team. A few countries are listed here, and also a number of multi-country programs that look promising for the purpose of impact evaluation. I'm briefly just looking at two of the designs that were developed. One is a Nigeria program, the Climate Resilient Infrastructure for Basic Services, CRIPS program, that is implemented in public healthcare centers and schools in northwest Nigeria. And the other is our Building Resilience in the Sahel program, which is a large resilience program implemented by UNICEF and partners in 5 countries in the Sahel zone. This slide summarizes the first of these 2 programs, the CRIPS program, a program that seeks to increase the climate resilience of 1,000 public healthcare centers and schools in northwest Nigeria. The theory of change here is very, very small, but if it were bigger, you would see that it's a complex program. It covers a number of different sectors, health, WASH, education, etc. And the main activities are infrastructure investments. The infrastructure is the focus of these impact evaluation designs. Our team reviewed this program, came up with 2 main options. One is an RCT, one is a quasi-experimental design. I won't go into those details, just saying that the first one, the RCT, is an experimental approach that would match schools and public healthcare facilities with similar characteristics between a treatment group and facilities outside of the program to create a control group. And then they were thinking about randomly assigning students and patients, which, I have some questions around that. I agree with them, with our team, that some randomization is possible, but it is far from straightforward. So I have some question here whether or not that actually would be feasible and in practice. The second approach is a little bit more straightforward. It's a more traditional quasi-experimental approach that looks at experimental group, a comparison group, and primarily collecting data at facility level, but also additional data collection at the individual level would be planned. Both approaches would require pre-program baselines and then repeated data collection over time. The second program is quite a different program. It's the Building Resilience in the Sahel program. It's a program aimed at supporting more than 14 million people by increasing their resilience across several thematic areas. And the team looked specifically at the water component. And as part of the water WASH program component, the program will support communities with the monitoring of water resources using a community-based integrated water resource management approach. And what you see here also in small is a theory of change that doesn't come from the project. It was created by our IFA team for the purpose of this impact evaluation design. And with this particular program, the team saw quite a few challenges, especially if you start thinking about randomization. It is quite difficult if you look at, water resources that, and complex interrelationships, many different types of confounding factors that you will encounter when trying to randomize, the different, areas in which the program is working. So what they thought is, yes, there might be an opportunity for a quasi-experimental design, but there were also question marks around it. More straightforward approach would be a longitudinal study, where you don't have real control area, but rather monitor nationwide data trends over time, together with more qualitative theory-based evaluation to better understand what is observed in the data. So this is my last slide, a few key takeaways from this impact feasibility assessment. First of all, it wasn't an easy exercise, and it felt in particular tricky because we were trying to introduce two concepts at the same time. Working with program teams, often many of them had limited experience with impact evaluation. If they had experience with impact evaluation, often that wasn't the greatest experience, but rather a somewhat frustrating experience. And also there was a limited experience with climate evaluation as well. So then, we tried to combine climate and impact, and it got, it required quite a bit of discussion to get everybody on the same page and, help understand why this would be beneficial. At the same time, there was a lot of openness to explore this option, and there was an awareness and understanding that UNICEF will need to show evidence of impact of, our climate interventions moving forward, and that we do not currently have this evidence. So, the need for impact evaluation is well understood. The designs, found many constraints, and you saw, like, just what I briefly presented on the previous slides, that yes, not all of these designs are actual impact evaluation. They are not RCTs. At best, we might get to a quasi-experimental design. And that is not just because of the complexity of impact evaluation as a methodology, but really because of the complexity of the interventions that limit to some degree what reasonably can be done. What does that mean for UNICEF? I think with those programs that we looked at, yes, there is still opportunity for impact evaluation, but not, they might not suit themselves for complete RCTs. I think if we want to do RCTs in this sector, we have to design the RCTs together with the program. We can't come in, afterwards and try to integrate the RCT in something that already has been designed and is in the process of being implemented. However, even with the existing programs, I think the exercise showed that it is possible to to integrate some impact elements, and that might be, quantitative analysis based on existing data, some additional data collection, or perhaps a quasi-experimental design might well be feasible. And last point, what is next? The next step for this IFA is to actually realize some of those ideas, not necessarily in that exact context, perhaps in other contexts. I'm pretty sure this will be happening with UNICEF's next strategic plan. We will further build up our climate expertise, our climate programming. The need for better evidence will only continue to increase. So I'm certain sooner or later we actually will have results to present here rather than ideas how to get there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. To all my fellow panelists, this was a great cross-section to some of the findings, but also some of the challenges that we find on impact evaluations in the climate space. I would also like to thank everybody for inviting me here, because I'm not an evaluation specialist. I come from the world of program. So I was the former climate director at WFP, the new incoming climate director at UNICEF. So I'm a user of impact evaluations, and very often the challenges that we're facing in the trenches of programming are how can we meaningfully integrate the results from these impact evaluations in a very fast-moving world of climate action. And that world is really not only fast-moving because our country offices need to program, it's also we are running into a situation where climate mitigation is failing, climate change adaptation keeps failing, and we're really running out of time, right? So projects are being designed, and sometimes without looking at the evidence that we have available. So I think one first question that I would like to ask my fellow panelists is, of course, these impact evaluations, especially as we have seen in the first two cases, they have shown some really, I think, very concrete recommendations on how new programs could be improved. So, for example, when I look at the WFP example, we see that the benefits in Niger accrue at the agricultural production stage, but then people are falling back down into food insecurity during the lean season. So when you're working on programs, your thought is, how can we basically substantiate that program here? Can we provide better post-harvest systems? Can we diversify agricultural production so that we don't have that falling back into the lean season? And when it comes to anticipatory action, for example, there's always the question, especially when it comes to drought, what do people do with the cash, and what are the type of interventions that we can combine more meaningfully in order to also reduce these humanitarian impacts? So maybe this is a question to the entire panel. How do you think that, can you share some good practices on how you are connecting these evaluation functions with the actual operational side of your respective institutions? Do you think that this is going well? Do you think that we need, in this very fast-moving space, a bit more designated processes to make sure we're all looking at the evidence and doing better programming rather than only basically running after the funding and then basically repeating the mistakes that we have been made in the past? So the floor is open. Maybe I want to go down the panel starting here. And then basically I would like to invite all of you to also think about a few questions. I will then see your mics here on the screen, and we will then go through the room. Thanks. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much. So yes, we have a few good examples during this year, that country office have been using the evidence in designing the new phase of the programs or in adapting their programs. One thing I want to say is that we present these impact evaluation findings to country office or to the governments, but it's up to them, right, to decide how to best use the evidence. They know the context better. So usually it's a process where we discuss the findings together and contextualize the findings, and they should also think what makes more sense, right? It's not only us telling them, of course, what to do. Good example we have is that South Sudan, so the findings I've been presenting before, I didn't mention that it was a joint intervention implemented together by WFP and UNICEF. And actually, both country offices are using these findings to plan the next phase of the resilience programs. So some adaptations they've done is ensuring timely transfers during the lean season based on these findings that people are still unprotected during the lean season. Regarding the gender, that finding that females head of household were more food insecure, thinking what makes more sense in terms of assets that women can build, and if we should also think about that in the design, right, and make sure these assets are gender sensitive. And then I didn't mention this, but we also look at nutritional outcomes. WASH outcomes, because it's also a UNICEF program. One thing we found is that the nutrition support wasn't reaching everyone. Those living far away from facilities were not benefiting. So there's a clear programmatic implication, and I know it's easy to kind of fix, let's say. So this is just some of the examples I go to Paul.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think it's always important to think about which lessons are generalizable that can be taken and applied anywhere, and which ones are suited to the context that might need to be tested again as they come up in a specific project. In the anticipatory action space, I think the evidence suggests that projects can be thinking about how can my registration be used to plan for responses so that you're already ready and not scrambling to respond, and you can see the benefits of doing that. On the specificity side, I think thinking about when do people actually need support and what do they need it for, and think about not just the shock, but what are people doing as the shock sort of comes through. When are planting season happening? When do people need money for things like school fees? and then planning the response both around the shock and around those things. So some of the next phase that we're working on are thinking of combinations like how does cash work when provided with or without improved drought-resistant crop seeds, for example, or these tests of like, do we give all the cash at once or do we give some cash right at the trigger and then in a follow-up? So I think it's especially exciting to see the country offices come with those questions of not just should I be doing this because my donor wants me to be accountable, but how can I test two things against each other so I can see what works? And we always love talking to those projects.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I cannot tell you much in terms of the practices in the climate change space, but in the resilience space, broadly speaking, not strictly connected to climate, because we are carrying out many impact evaluations in Somalia at the moment, very complex settings, and we are seeing that a very useful moment of the impact evaluation timeline is connected to the inception phase. For instance, we have done a listing exercise that was essential for us to constructing the sampling frame because there is no registry data that exists, no census, at least recent one. And this was very useful for targeting purposes of both villages, communities, and then beneficiaries. And the country office saw the advantages of this approach. And in the new wave of funding requests to USAID BHA, wanted to dig deeper. This was for resilience and anticipatory action programs that they are planning for next year. So we are working on the experience that we had this year on the targeting and the construction of the sampling frame for the impact evaluations. And this has obviously some effects also on the future programming. Related specifically to climate change, well, this is more general. It's not just related to the climate space. It's how do we use our evaluation knowledge, our evaluation practices to connect with our programmatic approaches. And I see that the daily discussion with at least with the country office and other government stakeholders, it is essential to make these programs effective. So yeah, I do not have much to share in terms of the climate space because this is a very new area of work for FAO, especially for the Office of Evaluation. But with the experience that we have from other areas of war, especially conflicts in fragilities, we see some positive spillovers also in terms of programmatic implementation approaches. Thanks.
All right. So in our case, given the huge gaps in impact evaluation evidence on climate resilient WASH, I have no doubt that findings would be used and likely would be used extensively, and there is an awareness that they are needed. So as long as we do it properly, they are convinced by the methodology. I'm sure it would be picked up and it would be integrated in new programs.
Thank you. So I'm monitoring also, whether anybody would like to ask a question from the floor. Okay, I have the first one, microphone 1391. Can you please activate that one? Please.
My name is Arif Rashid. I'm with the USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. First of all, thank you to all of the presenters for very informative presentation. My question is to Paul. Did you look at the cost differential between pre-shock distribution versus traditional distribution? And then what % of households who received cash or assistance prior to the shock end up not experiencing any shock? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Both good questions. On the cost differential, the value of the transfers themselves is exactly the same. So because we're doing this all within the same transfer structure, using the same modalities, the transfer values are the same. So the real differential cost are very hard to quantify things like the cost of generating the forecast that's used to say that the flood will happen. So we take one of those off the shelf, like in Nepal, it's an organization called Glofos that provides these transfers. But what you really want to think about is the cost of shifting toward an anticipatory approach is the cost of how much do we need to generate forecasts and the coordination around making sure we have registries created. So I think a lot of the cost is, are you doing a for-purpose registration versus are you scaling up onto a registration that already exists, like a pension system or social protection system? So it depends on the specific context. And on the what percentage of people aren't actually affected, the easiest way to answer that question is just what the households themselves said. So for example, in Nepal, I think it's 70-something% say that either their house, their farm, or their business was affected by the flooding. So the remainder, not at all. And then there's a mix of which thing was affected.
Thank you, Paul. I have another request for the floor. This was, I think, 1386, followed by 1353. And those are the two last questions we're going to be able to entertain in order to have a sharp cutoff for the next session. Thank you. Please, over to you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you all the panelists, and my question is to Paul. Here I am. Yeah, so I'm more interested in the mobile money transfer in Bangladesh. So recently I just finished my project on leveraging digital finance in Ethiopia. So some of the challenges we faced when we surveyed, our target population was urban productive safety net program beneficiaries. So some of the challenges we faced were these people are very poor and they don't have a smartphone, and there is also issue related to access to internet. So what kinds of locally accessible intervention you suggest? Maybe those who don't have access to internet, who don't have a smartphone, and other issues, because these people are very, very poor. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to add, please, the second one right away. So over to 1353. Gentleman here. Thank you.
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Dante Fernández del Ministerio de Desarrollo e Inclusión Social de Perú.
Good morning, my name is Dante Fernández of the Ministry of Social Development and Inclusion.
Gracias, Tom. Una pregunta para Paul. Me gustaría saber cómo identificar a la población vulnerable prediciendo, ¿no?, antes que suceda un evento, un impacto climático, ¿no? Porque
Yes, Paul, a question for you. How do you identify the vulnerable population before the shock, the climate shock, for your study?
Thank you. Gracias.
Okay, just very quickly, I think the access to mobile money is a really good point. It's a lot easier to do in Bangladesh than it would be in some contexts. So for example, in Nepal, we didn't have enough of the population owning phones to be able to do that. So it's really important to think about, like, well, there are clear advantages of mobile money. Can you do it everywhere? And I'd be happy to talk about some of the ways I think there are actually some specific differences and impacts on mobile money that come up around the timing of when we see impacts that are related to people knowing that the money has actually arrived. So I didn't get into it in the short presentation, but let's talk after the session. And then the question about how do you identify your vulnerable population is a really good one, because it depends a lot on the type of disasters. In Nepal and Bangladesh, these are for-purpose registries that are done with plans to respond to flood events, which is easier because the flood happens on the river banks, basically. So if you know it's river flooding, you know where people live on the river, and it's a little bit of an easier problem, but it's a much harder problem for other things like droughts and floods. So I'd especially encourage you to go to the AI session this afternoon that's going to talk about forecasting food insecurity and maybe show some of those lessons about how early can we get information about where we think food insecurity is going to happen.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you also for your contributions, your attendance. I'm sure our panelists will remain available also after the sessions in the next break to answer some of your bilateral questions. Please join me in giving everyone a warm hand and thank them for their contributions.